Oh, anyone who's listened to my show, you know that if I could read better, my intros would be a lot better. So I'm gonna go ahead. I'm gonna read Mary Ann's intro live, and then we'll get right to it. Mary Ann is currently the Deputy Chief Operating Officer of the Control Center at the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, where she oversees all day-to-day and emergency response operations of the sixth largest mass transit provider in the United States. Prior to joining SEPTA, MaryAnn spent 15 years with the Federal Emergency Management Agency as the regional administrator for FEMA Region 3. MaryAnn served in a variety of roles across FEMA, including the senior official performing the duties of the deputy administrator in 2025, acting deputy administrator in 2021, acting regional administrator for Region 2 in 2013, and associate administrator for mission support in 2017. In addition to her permanent position, she's a qualified Type 1 federal coordinating officer and led one of FEMA's five national incident management assistance teams. She is deployed to several presidentially declared disasters to support survivors and communities and has served in senior coordinating roles for the Department of Homeland Security and National Security Council. MaryAnn has also worked in emergency management in New York City and Philadelphia. She has a BA from American University, an MPA from New York University, and has completed the three primary professional military education courses for general and flag officers. MaryAnn received the DHS Secretary's Outstanding Service Medal in 2021, the Presidential Rank Award Distinguished Rank in 2022, and the DHS Secretary's Meritorious Service Silver Medal in 2023. MaryAnn lives in South Philly with her husband, son, and dog, is an avid runner, and aspires to one day have a cooking show like Ina Garden, which I find completely relatable. I think every emergency manager has that, like, okay, I probably need to stop doing this at some point, and I have some goal of relaxing out in the woods somewhere and doing something completely different. For me, it's a used bookstore because cooking can be just as stressful as being in the EOC for me. Um, Now, MaryAnn, I've listened and to your interviews and read some of the things that you've created, and you're very people focused. And I want today's conversation to focus around people. And now, I typically don't stick to a script, but we have very limited time. So I know you have some prepared remarks you wanted to say up top, and then we'll get into our thematic questions. And the less people hear my voice, the better, as usual. So, MaryAnn, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Good evening. I guess for most people, it's early evening. And if you're on the West Coast, good afternoon. Like Matt said, I'm MaryAnn Tierney. I'm really excited to be here to talk about something I love, which is emergency management and crisis leadership. And so I was going to spend about 10 minutes kind of setting the stage, and then Matt and I are going to have a little back and forth. And I think then we're going to take some questions. So I'm going to dive right into it. So first, I want to talk a little about my personal journey and what that meant for me as a leader and some of my takeaways. Then I want to talk about you as a leader in emergency management, and I'll talk a little bit about crisis management, and then we'll go over to some Q&A. So, like Matt mentioned, I started my career in emergency management in New York City. I was there for about 8 years. Not at all what I had on my career list of things to do, but just kind of like at the time when at the time you really didn't go to school for emergency management. So I just kind of took a leap and dived into emergency management, realized that I liked it a lot, seized a ton of opportunities in the office. New York City is a big city. The office was really small when I started, so there was a lot of opportunity to do different things and grow. And I kind of really grew up in the planning area, writing a lot of different plans for New York City and working with the different agencies. It's a very large city, lots of challenges. Everything is at a very large scale. So it was really a great way to learn emergency management in a high paced and dynamic environment. But at the end of the 8 years, I had kind of gotten to where I was going to get in that office. And, I love the job. I could still be there today, to be honest with you. But it was time for like the next step. And so having the courage to take that next step was a really, kind of like a thing that I did. And it was a really good move for me. So what I take away from my time in New York City and what I would share with you all is, like, in your job, you have to be willing to take the next leap, even if it's scary and unknown. And so after I left New York City, I moved to Philadelphia, a city I had never been to except for the interview for the job. And I moved into an apartment And I didn't know anybody in the city. And so that was, again, like a little brave, but it was a really good move. And Philly's emergency management office really needed a complete rebuild. They had gone through a study after Katrina to look at their preparedness, and they had developed a report with a consultant with over 200 recommendations. So at least I had my to-do list pretty laid out for me for the job. But it took a lot of work to rebuild the office and hire a team, and then kind of cultivate that team over time. But we were a small team, but very mighty. And Philly is a completely different city than New York. New York City is a very big city with a lot of resources, and you kind of can get very used to having that access to basically at the local level what I would describe as unlimited resources. But in a smaller city where resources are much more constrained, that was harder. And so really had to work on partnership and leveraging in a way that I did less of in New York City at the time. But that was also a really great growth experience. And, part of it, is like some of the things would work that I tried in New York City, but some wouldn't. And so, you have to be able to pivot and adjust to the new environment. Um, but then it was, I was in Philly for about 4 years, but then it was time to think about something else, and really not for work related, but the job that I had was very operational. And so, I would like have to go to fires at 2 o'clock in the morning or go to a water main break. And because the office was small, the demands operationally were much higher. And my husband and I were thinking about having a kid. And so like, I just did not think that that was very compatible with small children. So it was time to lean out and look for something else. And the FEMA job kind of opened up in Philly. We weren't moving. I married somebody from Philly. People from Philly don't leave Philly. And so there really wasn't like an opportunity for us to relocate. So um, I looked for a job. The FEMA regional administrator job opened. Somebody had actually called me about it and encouraged me to apply. And I applied, and was successful and got the job. And I started at FEMA in 2010. And before that, I had been pretty critical of FEMA from my time in New York City and then in Philly. In New York City, I did a lot of work with recovery and mitigation. And so I had a lot of, interaction with FEMA, and I had lots of opinions about the agency and things that they were doing wrong and, things that they were doing right. And the wrong list was a lot longer than the right list. And I thought I really understood FEMA. And then I went to work there and I realized that I only knew, I knew what I knew from my seat. And I really didn't understand a lot of like what the federal government did or how it all fit together. And so that was a really big learning curve. But also like, when you go and you work somewhere and you think you understand the agency, it really taught me that you have to walk in with an open mind and you have to really kind of check your assumptions, because your view of what an organization does is very different when you're on the outside. So you have to kind of know what you're walking into, but also be willing to be open minded. And then I was at FEMA for 15 years. I had a lot of really incredible opportunities. It was a great job. It's an amazing mission, amazing people. But sometimes you have to know when to walk away. And so I did that. And now I am at SEPTA, and I'm running their control center, which is, in mass transit agencies, if you're not familiar, every mass transit agency has a control center. And that's what runs the day-to-day operations of the mass transit agency. So when it hits the street, it's under my purview, and anything related to emergency operations is my responsibility. So it's a highly operational job. And one of the things that I really like about it's everything I love about operations. There's really none of the administrative entanglements that my previous job had. So I really get every day to focus on operational execution, and supporting our team and thinking about how we can evolve our operations. So that's very exciting. I even told somebody it's like being on a deployment all the time, because it's just a very tactical and operational role. I'm really enjoying that. So that kind of sums up my career a little bit and some of my takeaways. And now what I want to do is spend a little bit of time talking about just like you as a leader, right? Everybody on this call is a leader, because leadership isn't a title, right? Leadership is a choice that anybody can make. And leaders are not genetically superior. Like I never really viewed myself as a leader. And, even sometimes now I have to check myself and say, wait, I am leading this group. Leaders are not born, in my opinion. I think they're molded and matured and developed over time. They don't have a superhuman skills. And the point being a leader is inside of everybody. So if you don't feel like you're a leader, I would say you are. I said you just you have to unlock that potential. And how with that, everyone can lead, no matter where you are in an organization, whether you're the most junior person or the most senior person, you have a role in leading, right? You can lead yourself, you can lead your peers, and even you can lead up. And one of the greatest skills I think people can develop is the ability to kind of lead and manage up. The opportunity to lead is always in front of you. Part of being a good leader, I think, is knowing yourself, right? You have to be authentic. People can spot a fake, so don't try to be something you're not. It's great to read leadership books. It's great to look at people and say, I aspire to be like that. But you have to find what works for you, and it has to be genuine and authentic. And if it's not, people will see through that. It won't feel good. It won't feel like you, and you're your best version of yourself when you feel like yourself. Um, the other thing I found with leadership, and one of the things to think about, is that leaders, they don't just survive at the edge of discomfort, they thrive in it, right? So a lot of leadership is about being comfortable, being uncomfortable, because the things that leaders do are pushing at the edge, right? I always told our executives at FEMA, the things that land on our desk are all the hard things. If it was easy, somebody else figured it out. So the reason we're dealing with it is because it's different, it's hard, it's controversial, right? It's uncomfortable. That's what leaders engage in, and so you have to be really comfortable in that space, and you really have to thrive in it. Um, Often, when you lead teams, especially in crisis, you're always operating at the edge of your technical and managerial skills, right? I can say right now, switching to this job that I'm in, I'm not a mass transit expert. I'm learning a whole new language. I told somebody last week that my job now is, imagine running air traffic control, but also simultaneously fighting 5 fire alarm fires. And for me right now, it's like doing it in a foreign language. And so it's a lot of just rapid learning and understanding. But you have to push beyond that. And like I said, you have to be really comfortable in that uncomfortable space. And I'm getting a good reminder of that the past, I would say, 45 days. You also have to remember that setbacks are inevitable. Failure isn't a detour on the path of leadership. It's a part of the road. It's a feature of the system, not a bug. When leaders fail, you got to get up, you got to lead stronger, right? And you should talk about your setbacks and failures. It's an important part of being a leader, and I think growing and molding your team is talking about the times when you haven't, met the medal, and what you learned from that. And the other thing I've learned too is that leaders, they don't point fingers. You have to own your outcomes, right? And that helps you build credibility and trust. So like when things don't go according to plan or something didn't go well, right? It's not about blaming. It's about figuring out like what happened, in the sense of how are we going to learn from this so it doesn't happen again. I also think good leaders are reflective. You think about how you attack the problem or how you interacted in a given situation, and you learn from that so that you can improve. I also think empathy is a really key part of leadership. That's something that has really grown on me over the past several months. It's a leadership necessity in today's world. This country is facing a mental health crisis. Everybody is coming to work with things going on in their life, right? And people just don't leave that at the door. And so you have to really be mindful of the context that people bring to work, and you have to help them navigate that in a high pressure, high stakes job like emergency management. And you have to be able to help them be vulnerable so that they can feel comfortable sharing that. So I think that's just a little bit about leadership and like you as a leader. And I think those are good things that you should think about. And then the next thing I really wanted to focus on was kind of the crisis environment and some of the things that help you thrive in that. So I would boil it down to there's 4 key actions that leaders need to be thinking about when managing in crisis and leading in crisis. The first one is that you have to create clarity. You have to define and refine the goals even as they evolve. You need to understand that requirements may be unclear, even to the people setting them. I have been in many situations where working with the most senior people, and they're not even clear on what they're trying to accomplish. I think they have ideas of what they're trying to accomplish. They have an end state, but how to do that and what the constraints are, we're all navigating that together. So what you need to do is help understand what needs to be done today, like discern what needs to be done today while anticipating future requirements and challenges. You also have to be assimilating and reassessing information rapidly, right? So that you can align the strategic and operational goals. And you have to explain the why and over communicate. It's really important in a crisis that you're sharing information as much as possible. And you can't communicate enough. People receive information in many different ways. We live in a very distracted culture, and so over communication is really key. The next thing you need to be focused on is leading decisively. You have to take charge, inspire action, and adapt swiftly. So with that, you have to have a bias for action. You need to drive results and decisions that change outcomes. And you also need to know that, sometimes not making a decision is a decision itself, right? So you lose that decision window opportunity. Sometimes you also have to be patient, called strategic patience. You have to know when to make a decision and when you have to know when something needs to marinate so that you can make a better decision. And in a dynamic, fast-paced environment, there can be this, even with a bias for action, you can over decide, right? So you have to be really good at figuring out like what you need to decide now and what you can decide later based on different information, or again, letting people kind of cool down or kind of let the situation unfold a little bit. And that kind of decision maturity is really important in a crisis. You also need to be an honest broker, right? That builds and manages relationships and have a good network. You also need to remember that a lot of times in these complicated emergencies and crises, really influence and persuasion are more important than traditional command structures. As a FEMA field leader myself, a lot of the time, I don't command and control really anything, and it's important to build a big tent and get everybody in that tent so there's buy-in on the objectives. And then you can use that to drive action. But in complicated emergencies in a unified command environment, right, if you can even achieve unified command, it's important that you're trying to get people to align their interests and then use your role to nudge them to action. And that goes to my next point, which is that you have to find common ground, right? You need to develop allies and partners so that you can get the buy-in you need to accomplish things. And you have to remember that sometimes you have to build relationships with people that may make your team uncomfortable. This is important because sometimes you don't get to control who's involved in the narrative. So you have to keep the tent big and you have to keep your mind open about who you might have to partner with. And then you have to motivate diverse teams to push through the adversity. And remember that your presence and energy is going to drive that. So it's important as a leader to keep that in mind. The third thing is organizing chaos. I think this is a really cornerstone of the emergency management crisis leader. Bringing order to uncertainty by aligning people, right, and maintaining agility. So a lot of times in big crisis, you're harmonizing conflicting demands across multiple layers of government, right, conflicting interests, and you have to really focus on achieving unity of effort, right? I know in ICS we talk about unified command, unity of command, but really in these more complex, emergencies, which is more and more every day what emergencies are, it's really about unity of effort, right, and getting everybody to coalesce around a common set of objectives. You also need to get everybody on the same page. You need to keep them there, and you have to track progress with clear systems. The alignment of having clear objectives, having everybody on the same page, and having a system to track what everybody said they were going to do is really the key to acting decisively. And then you have to pick your priorities carefully, and then you have to pursue them relentlessly. Right? It's really important. Not everything can be a priority at the same time, especially as the leader. You have to decide what the most important things are for you, and you have to stay laser focused on them. And otherwise, don't let people distract you, right? Because a lot of other things will come flying at you, but you have to be clear about what you think the most important things are, and you have to stay very focused on them. But you still have to be ready to pivot, right? So you can't just have your list and stick to it. You got to remember that environment will change and you have to be able to change with it. And then the last thing is that you have to preserve your prerogatives, right? So you have to stand firm in your principles, even when under pressure. So you got to get comfortable saying no and speaking truth to power, even when difficult decisions are going to be on the table or unpopular truths are at stake. And you have to remember that sometimes making unpopular decisions is a part of leading. So you have to be okay with people being unhappy and people being unhappy with you, because your job as a leader isn't to make everybody happy. Your job as a leader is to deliver outcomes and to create an environment where people can be successful. Um, you also have to work on forcing the consideration of second and third order effects for the decisions that are being made, even when the environment pressures people to not have that kind of deep analysis. And your strength as a leader comes from your ability to think ahead and stand strong when others falter. And you have to be willing to give advice and counsel, but you have to be careful about getting emotionally involved in the decisions that are made, because that can really derail you and make you unfocused. So what I'll close out by saying is, I started kind of my remarks with saying that leadership is a choice, right? You have to choose to be a leader. Everybody has leadership inside of them. So I encourage you to step up, act, and make an impact, and don't wait for a title. And you can ask yourself, where will I lead today? So with that, those are my kind of prepared remarks. And now I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who I think is going to grill me for the next several minutes.
Thank you, MaryAnn. That was fantastic, and you've made my job very easy. And just a reminder to the people who are in the chat, please make sure you drop your questions. That way I can ask. We're about 15 minutes away from a live Q&A. But let's take a little bit of a step back, MaryAnn, because there are plenty of emergency managers who can go their whole career without working a major disaster. Meanwhile, you experienced one fairly early in your career on September 11th, 2001. Uh, were there uh, any leaders who inspired you, or any anecdotes of leadership that you can share with us from an event like that so early in your career?
Oh, I mean, there were so many people that I remember when 9/11 happened, I was just 2 years into emergency management. And again, emergency management was not going to be my job. It was just a thing I was doing before law school. So, um, it was my whole mindset after 9/11 completely changed around emergency management. And because I was so inspired by like what emergency managers do, what my agency was doing, how we were really helping people, and so I can't, I don't want to like pinpoint one story, but what I would say is that the leaders that I saw like took charge, made decisions, took risk, right? And really kind of helped bring the city back. And it was really incredible to be a part of that. There were so many different things that I was involved in, again, because our office was so small and we had such an enormous responsibility. And again, for somebody so junior in their career to be kind of thrust into that, it was a really, it was an opportunity to excel and build my skills. And I think about the tragedy of 9/11, and what can come from that tragedy is I think that it bore a whole generation of leaders in crisis management, right? And so, how do you take something so horrific and think about it in a way of how can you honor the people who were lost? I could say, well, that event turned me into was part of what turned me into the emergency manager and leader I am today. And so that's how I try to think about honoring those people.
Thank you. And that's so fascinating for a junior, a freshman emergency manager to be at the center of something so significant. It also represented a major change in emergency management, and one of many that you've experienced between the birth of Homeland Security and the post-Katrina camera. Um, what's your advice for people right now who are in a similar era of change and are trying to assert leadership?
Yeah, well, I mean, emergency management, I would say, is it really changing? I think what is changing is maybe who is going to do what, right? But I think the jury is still out on this cataclysmic shift that I keep hearing about. There are a variety of roles that government plays in emergency management. and even nonprofit and for-profit organizations, right? And so I think what we're navigating right now is, in particular in the public sector, is what is the right division of labor between local, state, and federal. There will be labor at each of those levels of government. I think what's to be determined and I think needs to be discussed further is how much labor at each level and what they're doing. But emergency management is a job that is going to be needed because emergencies happen and people need to be coordinating them. And more emergencies are happening every day. And it's not, I mean, we could spend time talking about climate change, but, the bottom line is that our infrastructure is old. Disasters are more complicated because they're interacting with older infrastructure, and our population requires more support because our population is aging and is and the socioeconomic status of many Americans is changing, and a lot of the people who live in large areas where there's significant risk for disasters may not speak English as their first language. And so there's an enormous amount of diversity in our communities and needs in our communities. And emergency managers are primed to be focused on those individuals because those people typically need the most help after a disaster.
Yeah, and especially now when you're seeing, I know there's a lot of questions about the federal prerogative, especially when it comes to the most vulnerable members of our community. And I'll pivot to that during the Q&A, and I see some questions in the chat. Um, and we have a segment here on the future of emergency management, and I have a bunch of tactical questions that I can ask. But for the sake of time, I would love to know your perspective as someone who's worked across the entire spectrum of disaster and from uh, local, state, federal. What does the future of emergency management look like to you?
I think that I think the future of emergency management is one where local and state governments will need to have more capacity to help the people in their communities, right? I say that knowing that 99.9% of disasters are already handled at the local and state level. But what I have seen missing as a gap are real programs that help individuals after disasters, right? And so there is, I think, an over reliance on the federal government for mid-tier events, right? When there's a catastrophic event, I think there's a clear understanding that the federal government needs to be engaged and we need to be supporting communities and survivors. There are a lot of events that are not catastrophic where FEMA is engaged and likely should not be. And we're engaged because our criteria for declarations are old and don't account for 2025, right? And also because I think it's an easy answer for state and local governments to transfer that financial responsibility to the federal government. And so I think that there's going to be a requirement into the future for state and local governments to take on more of that. And that's been a topic of discussion across three administrations that I have worked for, starting with the Obama administration. So this is not a new thing that we need to rebalance who does what. I think now, though, there is an enormous forcing function, um, you know, pushing us more in that direction. And I think how that plays out is to be determined, but I think fundamentally that's what we're talking about.
Obviously, a lot of the questions, if you're feeling the temperature of emergency management discussion right now, were about money. Uh, do you see any opportunity for funding to change in an innovative way at the state and local, or is this something we just need to reposture federal grants? What does the future of funding our programs look like?
I think that state and local governments are going to invest more of their tax levy dollars in the emergency management function because I think there is an appetite at the federal level to reduce the amount of grant dollars available. And let's be honest, I mean, I worked in local government. A lot of local government emergency management agencies would not exist were it not for the federal grant dollars. And I think that that has allowed state and local governments to abdicate their role in the emergency management function. And so, again, I think there's going to have to be a conversation about what level of emergency management this country wants to purchase, right? And who pays for that. And the federal government should pay for some of that. But right now, the federal government is paying for an enormous portion of that. And I think this administration, not that I think, I know, this administration is working to rebalance that.
The question that I'll ask, my final question with the 4 minutes that I have left, is you talked about building your big tent of people when it comes to preparing for and responding to disasters. In your opinion, is anyone missing from that tent right now on the larger scale? And are there voices and skills that need to be elevated that are underrepresented in emergency management as it stands today?
Well, I mean, yeah, you could always make the tent bigger. I think, as a profession, I think diversity would be important, more, is important in our profession. I think emergency management should look like the people we serve, and we're a diverse country, and we should be working to have a diverse emergency management workforce. And that is challenging. Even at FEMA, we did a ton of studies around diversity in our workforce, and we had a very diverse workforce. We have, the agency has a very diverse workforce up to like the GS, well, notwithstanding what's happening to FEMA right now, but previously at the GS 13 level and below, FEMA has a fairly diverse workforce. It's when you get to the upper levels of FEMA, the diversity drops off. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And it especially drops off when you get to the senior executive ranks. Some of that has to do with the nature of the work. I mean, like I go back to what I said at the beginning. The reason I left Philadelphia emergency management is because we were going to have a kid, and I just did not think that that job was compatible with having a small child. I couldn't imagine standing in front of a burning. First of all, standing in front of a burning building 9 month pregnant did not seem like the best choice for me. Maybe for some people that could be a fine choice. For me, it was not a choice that I was making.
Sure.
And then also, I would have to 2 o'clock in the morning, I would have to leave and go somewhere or, work 18 hours. And I just didn't think that that kind of job was going to work. And then I went to FEMA, and actually it was like just as incompatible with having small children, which I could see why, at the level I was at, I had women, I would try to get women to apply for jobs at FEMA all the time in the upper ranks. And I got a lot of feedback of that job is not good because I have small kids. Right. And so you have to, have a whole support network when you have children. And when, especially, I can speak about women in particular, when women reach the peak of their, kind of like that part of their career where they're really going to rapidly accelerate, it's also like your peak time for having kids. And so there's a conflict there. And we could do more in our workplaces to make them more friendly and compatible with that so that you could encourage women to move up the ranks. I think we need to do more to bring a diverse workforce in by thinking about educational opportunities, internships, incentivizing folks like through college loan repayment. Those are things that I think would help our workforce be more diverse as well.
That's fantastic, MaryAnn, and thank you so much for speaking that truth to power. And I am going to pivot to our audience because we have just about 10 minutes left with you. So what I want to do is take a look at the chat. I'm going to ask these questions. Feel free to say next at any time if it's not a topic that you want to address. But our first question is from Jenny Katz, and Jenny's asking, when trying to unify and create a common effort against competing agendas, what is your approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing I always try to do is understand the problem we're trying to solve, the outcome we're trying to achieve, right? So sometimes people think they have competing interests or agendas because they're not even clear on what like the outcome is. So first is like, let's level set on what we're trying to do here, right? And then kind of work backwards from that. And some of that can involve like one-on-one shuttle diplomacy. Some of that can be group meetings. But I always find you got to start with the thing we're trying to solve for, and then try to get everybody's interest to align around that. Ultimately, in emergency management, I think we're all trying to do the same thing, which is help people before, during, and after disasters. How we do that is where, the mechanics of that is where you could get disagreement. But I think within that, if you can focus on the problem you're trying to solve and then try to align interests where you can against that, that building those small wins of cooperation can lead to bigger wins. And that's where I found I have been successful.
In your career, have you encountered things like emergency managers being reappropriated to missions that may not fit what we anticipated we'd be doing or conflict with our moral obligation to our community? Uh, and are you willing to speak to any of the contemporary issues regarding that?
Well, I would say first, I would challenge the assumption that emergency managers have a traditional set of things that they do. I think
Okay.
in 2025, what I would say is that emergency managers, or maybe the EMS people don't get mad at me if I use the wrong blood type. We are like the O positive of problems. We are the
Yeah.
universal receiver of problems. And so a lot of times what happens is when a jurisdiction, right, government doesn't know where the problem fits, they give it to the emergency manager because the emergency manager has a core set of skills that are very good at solving problems that no one else knows how to solve, right? If you think about the things that make you a successful emergency manager, they make you really successful at coordinating. Like it's facilitation, it's critical thinking, it's like organizing all the cats, right? Herding all the cats, getting them on the same page and moving them in the same direction. That could just be like professional cat herder could be the emergency manager's top line job description, right? And so when you got a hard problem in government and you need to herd all the cats, you get the emergency manager involved, and guess what? It usually gets coordinated, right? So we're a victim of the success of our core competencies. So emergency management, even from when I was 25 years ago, was doing things that some people would say was not in my job jar. Like I ran a rat task force. I helped lead mosquito spraying one year. I was involved in a defibrillator project, and then when I came to Philly, I, collected a random assortment of things too. And then at FEMA, FEMA collected a random assortment of things too, because FEMA is the federal government's emergency manager. And when you got a sticky problem and you don't know how to solve it, you give it to the emergency manager. Now, the thing that I would always say, and Administrator Criswell and I would talk about this all the time, is the federal government needs an agency like FEMA. It needs a catch-all. But if the federal government is going to give FEMA that responsibility, it also needs to give it additional authorities and the resources to perform that successfully, right? And so we as a profession are a victim of our success of being able to do the thing that other government agencies can do, but not at the scale that emergency managers can do. And so I challenge the assumption that we have a traditional job set.
I would agree, especially since across all spectrums. I've heard you talk before as well. Is we're fantastic coordinators. You need a thing to get done. We can do it. You need a plan written, challenged, tested. Doesn't matter what the plan is. The methodology is there, and we're good at it. Um, Now you've objectively successfully navigated between public private, all different levels of government, and the question from the audience is how did you know when it was time to leave any of these roles and start pursuing the next one, and how do you navigate that challenge in your career?
Yeah, well, I think in New York City, I came to the realization that like I just wasn't gonna get like I had gotten to where I was gonna get. And there was nothing I was gonna do inside of New York City emergency management that was gonna get me to the next level. So I left thinking that I would go back eventually at a higher level, but I just didn't see that path inside of the agency. And so that's how I landed in Philly, right? My plan for Philly was I was going to do that job for a few years and then go back promoted in New York City, right? But I got married, I had a kid, I found FEMA. Life happens. And then like I mentioned, I knew when it was time to leave Philly, which again was that I really liked that job, but I could probably still be doing it. It wasn't like I needed to leave. But I went to FEMA, and then FEMA was supposed to be my forever job. So I was there for 15 years. My plan was, to work 10 more years, and then I was going to retire and teach and, like leave FEMA. And because it's an amazing agency, but things are happening to FEMA, and I was kind of at the pointy end of those things. And I just decided that I just was not going, I did not want to be complicit in what was happening with the agency, the dismantling of it, how our people were being treated. And based on how I sat, like where I sat in the agency, my staying enabled that. And so I made a choice that I was not going to help. And that's why I left. And so you need to decide, like everybody's got a line, right? And I used to think about that theoretically. You'd hear people talk about that. Usually they do it in the context of like military generals. And they say, oh, resign, if you can't follow orders or, and I always like, oh, that's so theoretical. Who does that, right? And then, you get kind of hit with that. And I will say, everybody has a line. You need to know what your line is, and then you need to honor it, because at the end of the day, what you walk away with is your integrity and your principles. Everything else, it's just a job. But, you need to be true to yourself, like I said in the beginning.
We talked about earlier, we talked about failure and the importance of failure. And I want to posture this in the context of a question that was asked, which was, what was one leadership lesson you wish you had learned earlier in your emergency management career? And I'll put a postscript on that is, are there any failures of leadership that you've experienced or that are worth sharing and learning from?
Oh my gosh, I have so many. I mean, you're like I mentioned, like I said at the beginning, like failure is a part of the journey, and so yeah, you're not being a good leader if you're not messing things up, it's just a part of how you grow. So yeah, I have a lot of things that I wish I would have done better or wish I had known. I'm trying to think of, well, when I started at FEMA, I came from local government, and like I said, I had lots of opinions about FEMA, most of which were not positive. My opinion has completely changed, just for the record, about FEMA, after being there for 15 years. Um, and so when I started at FEMA, I thought I kind of knew everything, and I kind of walked in that way. And FEMA's onboarding is not the best, still isn't, for executives. And so I would say like my first 18 months, I really stumbled. And that was hard, right? Because I had been very used to being successful. And then it took a while, and that really derailed me for not more than 18 months, right? But from that, I learned a ton about myself, right? And I really grew as a leader. So I think like without that stumbling, although it was like super painful and just not ideal, it really kind of set me off to be a much better leader, than I was when I got to FEMA. And I think if I had started at FEMA and had kind of like coasted or even was like medium, right, it wouldn't have been as impactful as like the total stumbles I had the first 18 months. So that's what I would say. I just learned, you got to be patient. Buy-in's really important. You got to hear people, all the things that you read about in the books. Like I screwed up like the first year and a half I was at FEMA, and it took a while to recover, but I recovered pretty well. And like I said, I think it really made me a better person. So.
And I'm getting the note from my producer that we are just about at the end of your time. And thank you for all that you've given us and the insight. I know people are, you're a voice that people really wait to hear, and very much respect in the work that we do. And I'm so grateful that you were able to come on and chat with us. Is there any parting advice that you'd like to leave the crowd with before we wrap up?
Yeah, I will say I know people are all like, because I read LinkedIn and things. People are all in a flurry about what's going to happen with emergency management, and I would say just emergency management is here to stay, right? The profession is an important part of how we deal with complex disasters, and you should be proud of the work that you do. And emergency management will weather this change, and I think it'll make the profession stronger. So stay strong.
MaryAnn, thank you so much again, and thank you to AEMO and EMEAA and the partners who put this together. And we're looking forward to continuing this series. And MaryAnn, I hope we get to connect again. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great weekend. And I don't know if Brandy is wrapping up, but that's the end of our time. Once again, MaryAnn, thank you so much.
You're welcome. It was great. Talk to you
Thank
soon.
you.
Take care.